Hello, my name's Mary Davis, one of the vets at Prior's Farm, and welcome to our equine reproductive series. The aims of these lectures are to guide you through the process of breeding your mare. We'll start off with choosing your stallion, different types of semen that are involved when choosing a stallion, and work all the way through to preparing your mare and eventually foaling your mare and a newborn foal. This will be split into 3 lectures, and as I said, the first lecture is about preparation, so choosing your stallion, types of semen, preparing your mare in terms of talking a little bit about the oestrus cycle, talking about the artificial insemination process, and then finally the last lecture will cover pregnancy and the birth. So today we're going to focus on breeding your mare and preparing your mare for breeding. We'll firstly discuss choosing the stallion, then we'll talk about various different options for semen, then we'll move on to the mare and we'll talk about getting her ready for breeding. So pre-breeding assessment, pre-breeding health checks, and then understanding her oestrus cycle. And when we talk about her oestrus cycle, what we mean is her natural cycle in terms of when she is in season and when she's receptive to the male. Okay, so first things first, we need to choose our stallion. Now, choosing a stallion can be really exciting, but it also can be a bit daunting. And there's lots of things you can try to consider to help you guide you through the process of choosing your stallion. Critically look at your mare and look at her strengths and her weaknesses and try to complement a stallion with that. Think about her temperament. So what sort of foal are you looking to breed? What kind of temperament would complement your mare? Look at her conformation. Now, this is a little bit more controversial. You aren't going to be able to completely correct for any conformational abnormalities you have in your mare just by breeding with a stallion that has excellent conformation, but you can dilute conformational problems. So really critically assess the stallion in terms of his conformation. Look at his feet, look at his hocks, and think about his back and his overall conformation, and check that complements your mare. Have a think about athletic ability. So what is it you want to breed into your foal? Do you want a foal that you're going to go and do eventing or racing or endurance, or are you looking for show jumping and dressage? And really take that into account when choosing your stallion. It's always useful to look at the bloodlines, so check the stallion's sire and dam lines. It can give you a lot of information about the breeding of that stallion. Fertility, that's always a really useful thing to look at. You can always inquire about the stallion's fertility. And you can ask specific questions about his semen, the quality of his semen, the density of sperm within the ejaculate, and the motility and mobility of that sperm, and that will give us a really good indication of the fertility of the stallion. Health checks are really, really important. We need to have the paperwork accompany the semen when we order that semen in, and it essentially tells us that stallion is free from diseases that are passed sexually through the semen. Any semen that's shipped internationally must be accompanied by appropriate health certificates, and any semen that's shipped within the UK should be accompanied by health checks. There's nothing more frustrating for us as vets and for you as owners to not have that paperwork there. If the semen arrives and our mare is ready to go, we can't inseminate the mare without the appropriate paperwork. And that's really frustrating for you guys, and it's really frustrating for us. So just make sure when you come to order the semen, just a quick question to say, will this semen be accompanied by appropriate health certificates? Can prevent that situation. Progeny is a useful thing to look at. By looking at the offspring of the stallion, it can give you a really good indication as to what sort of foal you're likely to breed. So look at their temperament, their conformation, their athletic ability and their performance, and it can really give you a guide as to what type of foals that stallion throws. Okay, so now we've chosen our stallion, we need to think about various different ways in which the semen can be provided. And that will affect how you breed your mare. So there's various different options for how semen is delivered and inseminated into the mare. And understanding that along with the pros and cons is really important so that you know what you're entering into. So there's essentially 4 different ways in which semen is provided: natural cover, fresh chilled, and frozen. So one option is natural cover, and it's essentially what it says on the tin. So horses are covered either in hand or they're turned away with the stallion and run naturally in the herd. Typically, mares will be observed to be an oestrus, so receptive to the male, and then they'll be covered every other day until they no longer stand for the stallion, or they're just turned out in a herd and nature takes its course. The other option is fresh semen. Now, fresh semen is when you're taking the semen, you're collecting the semen from the stallion and inseminating the mare at the same time. So the mare has to be on the same stud as the stallion, which is why it's not a commonly used method. The third is fresh chilled. So this is when the semen is collected from the stallion, it's processed and then chilled and then transported. That semen will last between 48 and 72 hours, so it can be shipped internationally to the mare and then inseminated into the mare when the mare is due to ovulate. The final option is frozen. Now, with frozen semen, the semen is collected, it's processed, and then it's frozen in liquid nitrogen in small straws. Now, that semen is, once it's frozen, it can be stored indefinitely. So you can keep the gene pool of stallions long after they've passed on. Once defrosted, that semen will last between 6 and 12 hours. But it means that you can ship that semen internationally and store it for long periods of time in liquid nitrogen. So it might be worth, at this point, considering the pros and cons of fresh and frozen semen and various different methods for breeding your mare. So with the natural approach, your fertility rates are going to be higher. The semen is not processed, it's a very natural process. However, you've got to move your mare to the stallion, and other disadvantages include injury that may occur to the mare or to the stallion or to the handler as they cover the mare in hand. Some mares will react to the natural semen. Within an ejaculate, there is the sperm, and then there's the ejaculate fluid, which is removed whenever we process the semen. So chilled and frozen samples won't have that ejaculate fluid in, and some mares will react to that ejaculate, which reduces their chances of pregnancy. So some mares have a greater fertility with chilled or frozen semen. So with fresh chilled semen, advantages include good fertility rates. You also can use a wider selection of stallions because the semen can be shipped internationally. So we can choose from a whole range of stallions around the world and get that semen delivered fresh. So you've got a nice wide gene pool. The disadvantages of it include more veterinary input needed because we're not just covering these mares naturally. We need to time the ovulation and the insemination more precisely. And with that comes more veterinary input. And unfortunately, with post, sometimes it's difficult to get semen, not just internationally, but within the UK on a weekend. And if a mare is due to ovulate on a weekend, that can present some problems. Lastly, looking at the pros and cons of frozen semen. Now, one of the big benefits of frozen semen is that we can store that frozen semen indefinitely. So we can widen our gene pool by having a wide selection of frozen semen in store from multiple different stallions. And it's stored and it's defrosted as required. And again, the semen can be shipped internationally. Now, as we've said before, the frozen semen, once defrosted, is only viable. So those little sperm are only going to live for between 6 and 12 hours, which means that we have to time the artificial insemination quite precisely to when the mare is going to ovulate. And with that comes more veterinary input, more scans, and more involvement to get that precise timing right. And because the semen has been frozen and because we're using smaller volumes, our fertility rates will be slightly lower with the frozen semen. So you can see there's pros and cons to each of the methods, from natural, fresh and frozen. And really it's about considering all of the options and then coming up with an option that suits you and your mare and the stallion that you want to use. Okay, so moving on to the mare. Now we've discussed the stallion and the options for semen, it seems the next sensible thing is to think about our mare. Now we're ready to think about breeding from her. And the first thing we need to do is think about a pre-breeding assessment. Now, that will involve assessment of her external genitalia. So we assess her back end, her vulva, her perineum, and her mammary tissues to check that there's no concerns with regards to her conformation. We'll also perform an ultrasound examination of her uterus, her ovaries, and her cervix. And really, this is just a case of checking that everything is anatomically correct, and also a good opportunity to see where she is at within her cycle. So to see whether she's in season or not in season at that particular time. We also need to perform a general clinical exam to make sure that we feel the mare is suitable for breeding and is also able to carry that mare to term. So, for example, a mare that's lame or a mare that has problems with her feet or her back or orthopedic problems might not be suitable for breeding because of the excess weight that she's got to carry that foal through to term. The other things we need to think about is doing some pre-breeding checks. So typically we'll take a clitoral swab, sometimes an endometrial swab, and what we're looking for there is organisms that sit within the clitoris or within the uterus, the lining of the uterus, and we're checking for organisms that affect fertility. And so a simple swab sent off to the lab can tell us whether those organisms are present. So we may also take some bloods to look for diseases that are sexually transmitted, diseases such as equine infectious anemia and equine viral arteritis. And that's just a simple blood test. We might choose to take some blood also to look for strangles, especially if that mare is coming onto a stud. So if you've got a lot of movement of horses, it's always useful to check for horses that may be carriers or have strangles. So we take a blood test to check for that. So the next thing is to think about monitoring our mare for oestrus behaviour and understanding her oestrus cycle. Now, what we mean by oestrus is essentially a mare that's in season. So mares will, throughout the spring and the summer, so their breeding season, they will cycle on a 21 to 22 day cycle. So if you think about it, every 3 weeks throughout the breeding season, that mare will come into season, and then during that season she will ovulate, and then she will come out of season again, and that will repeat on a 21-day cycle. Now, that time which she is in season, i.e. she's receptive to the male and she's ready to be bred, can last between 4 to 7 days. So we've got our 21-day cycle, and then within that we've got our 4 to 7 day window where she's in oestrus, i.e. she's in season. Within that window, she's going to ovulate approximately 1 to 2 days before the end of oestrus, so the end of that season. So a mare that's in season can ovulate anywhere between day 2 and day 6 of her season. And that's the point that we really need to be precise on in terms of when we inseminate our mares. So there's lots of different things we can look at when we're assessing a mare to see if she's in season or not. And to show how a mare shows us that they are ready for breeding. And really, it's split into two different areas. Firstly, the mare and her behaviour, and secondly, ultrasound scanning of her reproductive tract. So, in terms of her behaviour, a mare will show she's in season by lifting her tail. She might swish her tail, she might tilt her pelvis, and she might urinate more frequently. She may also wink her clitoris, which is when at the base of the vulva. So if you lift her tail, you'll see her vulva. At the base of the vulva is the clitoris. And when she comes into season, you'll see her winking that clitoris, i.e. she'll invert it and evert it to show that she's in season. The other way we look for whether a mare is in oestrus or in season is to scan her reproductive tract. So using ultrasound, we scan her ovaries and we scan her uterus and we scan her cervix. Now, looking at the ovaries, we're looking for a dominant follicle. So a follicle, which is a little fluid-filled sac that contains an egg. As she comes into season and just prior to ovulation, that little sac or that little follicle will grow and grow and grow until the point where it ovulates. So we're monitoring the size and the shape of the follicle. We're also looking at the uterus. So a mare in season will have a soft uterus that's got some more fluid within the walls of the uterus, something we call edema. So we score the mares in terms of how edematous their uterus is. She might also have some pre-breeding fluid sitting within the uterus, which might affect how we treat that mare and pregnancy fertility rates. And then we look at her cervix. So we feel her cervix digitally, and we look at her cervix with a speculum. And what we're looking for is a softening cervix that's fleshy and pink, and an in season, essentially. So those are the things we're looking for to see whether a mare is in season, and to check where she is within her estrus cycle. And once we've got a mare in season, then our next step is to think about the timing of artificial insemination. So that nicely brings us on to our next presentation, where we go through the process of artificial insemination and breeding the mare. So thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll see you on the next session. Thank you.